My name is Thea Bennett, and I'm 34 years old. 3 days before Christmas, I came home from a 12-hour night shift and found my whole life stacked on my parents' porch in black trash bags, tied off neat, with a brand new brass deadbolt shining on the front door. I'm a nurse. I had spent 2 years under that roof taking care of my dad after his stroke, and my family locked me out the way you'd cancel a subscription. That morning, I still believed it was a misunderstanding. By Christmas Eve, I was signing my name into a homeless shelter 4 blocks from the church where I was baptized. And what a stranger on the next cot said to me that night cracked my family's story straight down the middle. What I chose to do with it, that part, none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where women who carried everything finally learned to set it down, told slow and calm, the way you'd tell a friend at the kitchen table. If these stories find you somewhere familiar, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Now, let me take you back to that porch, 3 days before Christmas, while the coffee in my thermos was still warm. I stood on the porch and counted the bags. 9 of them. 34 years folded into plastic, knotted with the same neat little rabbit ear ties my mother uses on bread. I rang the bell of the house I'd paid the utilities on for 2 years. The door opened 4 inches, to the end of its chain, and my mom looked at me through the gap like I was selling magazines. She said the house was sold, that the buyers would close in January, and that it was time everybody stood on their own 2 feet. I asked her to say that again, slower, because I'd been awake since 4 the previous afternoon, and I thought maybe exhaustion was rearranging her words. She didn't say it slower. She said it colder. Behind her, down the hall, I could see the shape of my dad in his recliner by the window, the outline of the walker beside him, and he did not turn his head. I said, "Mom, it's December 22nd. I said, "I gave you my paychecks." I heard my own voice do the thing it does with dying patients' families. Level, careful, keep everyone calm. She looked at me through that 4-inch gap and delivered the sentence she'd been polishing my whole life. In this family, love is earned. Then the door clicked shut, soft as a pill bottle. I stood there in my scrubs with snow starting to catch on the trash bags, and the strangest thought floated up, calm as you please. She didn't even sound angry. You don't get angry at a subscription. You just cancel it. What I didn't know yet was why the house had to sell so fast, and where that money was already promised. Let me back up 2 years, so you understand how a grown nurse ends up locked out of her childhood home with 9 trash bags. When my dad had his stroke, I was renting a decent 1-bedroom across town and working full-time hospice. Mom called me from the hospital hallway, crying in that careful way she has, and said, "Thea, we need you, just for a few months." So I did what daughters like me do. I gave up my lease, cut my hours back to keep his therapy schedule, and moved into my old room with the rosebud wallpaper. Mom set up what she called the household account, a joint account, her name and mine, because, she said, "Honey, you work nights. Let me handle the bills so nothing lapses." Every month, my direct deposit went in. $2,150, give or take. His pills, the mortgage, the gas bill, her hair appointments. It all swam in the same pond, and I was the only one filling it. I want to be clear, because I know how this sounds. I was not asleep at the wheel. In November, I was checking the statement and found a $9,000 transfer out of the household account into a certificate of deposit with only her name on it. I asked her about it that same night, straight out, at the kitchen table. She slid a folder of pharmacy receipts across to me like a lawyer resting her case and said, "Medicare doesn't cover everything. And did I want my father to go without?" I changed my direct deposit back to my own checking that week, but the 2 years of money already in the pond? Legally, that was a gift, $52,000 of gift. And a realtor's gray SUV had started parking outside our house on Tuesdays. I had asked about the SUV too. A man in a fleece vest walked our fence line taking pictures on his phone, and I came out on the porch and asked Mom who he was. She didn't blink. "Reappraisal for the homeowner's insurance," she said. "Rates are criminal these days." There was no sign in the yard. There was never going to be a sign in the yard. I learned later she sold it quietly. through a realtor friend from church, because signs invite questions, and my mother has never once in her life invited a question. So now do the math with me, standing on that porch on December 22nd. My own checking account held $1,140 because everything else had been swimming in her pond. My Corolla had started slipping gears the week before, and the shop wanted $1,900 to rebuild a transmission on a car worth maybe $1,200. The agency had cut my December shifts to almost nothing. Census drops around the holidays. Families take their people home for Christmas. God love them. Every apartment complex in Millbrook wanted first month, last month, deposit, and proof of income 3 times the rent. And my proof of income looked like a woman who'd spent 2 years working part-time for her mother's pond. The Starlight Motel on Route 9 cost $79 a night. I sat in my dying car in their parking lot and rationed my own life the way I titrate morphine. Enough, and not one drop more. 2 nights, I decided. 2 nights while I fixed this. Because there had to be a way to fix this. That afternoon, I made a phone call I'd sworn I would never make. I called the police on my own family. The officer who came out to the Starlight was young enough to be my former student, and kind, and useless. He listened, nodded, wrote nothing. You live there 2 years, ma'am? Then you're likely a tenant, and a lockout like that isn't legal. But it's a civil matter. Civil matter. I would come to hate that phrase the way I hate wound odor. He couldn't drag my mother out in cuffs for changing a deadbolt. I'd have to file, serve notice, wait on a docket that wouldn't wake up until well into January. I called legal aid from the motel bed and got a cheerful voicemail. Closed for the holidays. Reopening January 2nd. If this is an emergency, dial 911. I almost laughed. Which emergency, exactly? My friend Dana from the agency offered me her couch before I even finished the sentence, then remembered out loud that her in-laws were already sleeping on it, plus an air mattress in the hallway, and her voice got small with shame that belonged to my mother, not to her. And here's the part I need you to understand, because it's the question everybody asks. No, I could not just go back and force my way in. It's a misdemeanor to break a lock on a door you're not on the deed for, and more than that, my dad was behind that door. Half his body still didn't answer him. If I came through that door with a locksmith and a cop, whatever happened next would happen in front of him. I'd spent 10 years keeping other people's worst days calm. I wasn't going to hand my father one of his, so I did the thing that still amazes me. I waited politely, like a good girl, while the water rose. Checkout at the Starlight was 11 in the morning on December 24th, and I stood at the desk holding my card while the manager apologized to the wall behind my head. A pipe had burst in the East Wing overnight. Half the rooms were closed, the rest were taken by stranded holiday travelers. And no, he couldn't extend me. And yes, he was sorry. The next motel was 6 miles up the interstate. My transmission had died completely the night before in the Starlight lot. The car moved forward with all the conviction of a shopping cart with a locked wheel. And the buses in Millbrook stop running at 6 on Christmas Eve, assuming they run at all. I want to tell you I handled it with grace. Mostly, I sat in my cold, dead car behind the agency office, wearing 3 shirts, doing paperwork math in a spiral notebook. I'd spent 10 years charting other people's declines. Mine took 4 days, start to finish, and fit on 1 page. I washed my hair in the YMCA sink with the pink soap from the dispenser and told the front desk girl I'd been camping. She was 19. She believed me, or was kind enough to pretend, which by that point amounted to the same mercy. Around 4 o'clock the temperature started falling like something cut loose, and the radio said an Arctic front, wind chill advisories, single digits overnight. I walked to the gas station for coffee, counting my cash out of habit, and that's when I saw the paper sign taped inside the dark window of St. Brigid's Parish Hall, hand-lettered in red marker, the ink gone a little sideways. Warming center. Open tonight. All welcome. All welcome. Even, apparently, me. By 8 that night, it was 9 degrees, and the wind came down Chestnut Street like it had a grudge. 4 blocks from the gas station to St. Brigid's. I know because I counted them the way you count contractions. Something to do that isn't feeling. I stood across the street from the parish hall for longer than I will ever admit to anyone but you. The windows glowed that deep amber that church basements glow, and through the glass I could see folding tables, coffee urns, a woman in a Santa hat stacking blankets. I had a job. I had a license in good standing and a retirement account with $4,000 in it that would cost me a penalty to touch and wouldn't clear for weeks anyway. I had a family 2 miles away with a wreath on their new deadbolt. And I stood in a wind chill of 9 degrees below sane, negotiating with a door, because walking through it meant admitting what I was that night. There is a specific pride that gets women like me killed. I'd seen it in patients, the ones who won't press the call button, who apologize for bleeding on the sheets. I heard my own voice, the nurse voice, say out loud in the empty street, "Honey, you're cold, and the building is warm, and that is the whole of the situation." So I crossed. The door was heavier than it looked. Inside it smelled like coffee and wet wool and cinnamon from somebody's crock pot, and a man with a clipboard smiled at me without a flicker of judgment and asked for a name for the sign-in sheet. My family's name. I gave it to him, and my voice only broke on the second syllable. They gave me cot 14 against the east wall, under a construction paper angel some Sunday schooler had scissored a little drunk. The parish hall held maybe 30 of us that night. An old man with a cough I clocked as bronchitis before I'd even set my bag down, a young mother with 2 kids who sang Silent Night flat and beautiful, a man in an army coat who slept sitting up. Volunteers in reindeer sweaters moved between the tables with cocoa. I lasted about 20 minutes as a guest. Then I saw a volunteer kneeling over a woman's heel, holding a bandage like it might go off, and my body just stood up and went. 10 years of habit wearing my legs like a coat. I dressed the blister properly, checked 2 blood pressures, and talked the coughing man into promising he'd see the free clinic Friday. It helped. Not them. Me. Being useful is my resting heart rate. And that night, in that room, I could feel the difference for the first time between being useful because you're loved and being useful because you're afraid to find out what happens when you stop. I sat back down on cot 14 with that thought when a woman settled onto the cot next to mine with 2 paper cups of cocoa and handed me one like we'd known each other 30 years. Silver hair in a long braid over one shoulder. Reading glasses on a beaded chain. Hands steady, eyes quick. I'd have guessed retired cop or dispatcher or the person who runs the church rummage sale like a military operation. She watched the kids sing for a while. Then she looked at me, friendly and level, and asked the question that broke my life open. "What's your name, honey?" "Thea," I said. "Thea Bennett." I watched it hit her. She set her cocoa down on the floor, slow and deliberate, the way you set down something you cannot afford to drop, and both her hands came up to her mouth. The gasp came out of her like it had been waiting in her chest for years. Cot springs, cocoa steam, the kids on their 3rd verse. Everything went on around us and she just stared at me over her fingertips with her eyes filling up. I did the mental checklist you do. Stroke, sugar crash, grief. She shook her head like she could hear me running it. "Bennett," she said. "Your grandmother." Was her name Ruth? Ruth Bennett, off Sycamore. Ruth with the tomatoes? And now the cold came back into me, because my grandmother had been dead 20 years and nobody brought her up. Not in my family. In my family, Grandma Ruth was a closed file, a difficult woman, a story with the ending sanded off. I said yes. Ruth was my grandmother. The woman reached out and took my hand in both of hers, and hers were shaking, and mine, I noticed clinically, had gone very still. "Honey," she said, "my name is Maggie Doyle. I've been looking for you for 20 years. Quick pause here, from me to you, listening in your car or your kitchen. If you have ever been the one your family calls first and thanks last, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight." I read every one of them. It helps more than you know to hear I wasn't the only one, because what Maggie Doyle said next, on a church cot on Christmas Eve, is the reason you're hearing this story at all. She said, Your grandmother hired me. And she left you something, but there was a condition, and sweetheart, you just met it. I didn't believe her. I want that on the record, because I've watched enough con artists work enough grieving families to know how this sounds. A stranger at a shelter knows your name, produces a dead relative, promises an inheritance. That's not a miracle. That's a Tuesday in elder fraud. So I asked questions, flat nurse questions, and Maggie Doyle answered every one without reaching for a single note. She knew my middle name is June, after Ruth's mother. She knew about the burn scar on Grandma's left wrist, the pale comma from an oven rack in 1988, because Ruth had rolled up her sleeve at their first meeting and said she wanted Maggie to be able to identify her granddaughter's people by their damage. That sounded so much like the grandmother I remembered that my throat closed. Then Maggie took out her phone, scrolled with the terrible slowness of a woman in reading glasses, and turned the screen to me. A photograph of a photograph. Me at 11, gap where a molar had been, standing in front of Grandma Ruth's tomato steaks, holding a colander like a trophy. I remembered the colander. I remembered that whole afternoon. The last summer they let me go up there. Maggie said she'd been a licensed private investigator out of Columbus for 31 years, retired at 62, and that in the winter of 2005, a small, straight-backed woman had walked into her office, put a folder on her desk, and said she needed someone patient. Not fast. Patient. Ruth Bennett, Maggie said, was the most organized client I ever had, and I did skip traces for banks. Around us, the shelter was dimming its lights, volunteers herding kids toward cots. 20 years, I said. Nobody looks for anybody for 20 years. Maggie smiled with about half her mouth. You weren't lost, honey. That was never the job. I wasn't looking for where you were, Maggie said. I always knew where you were. Same town, same job, same address. God help you. I was looking for the day you'd need me, and I spent 20 years hoping it would never come. She said Ruth had paid her a retainer and left instructions that read less like a case file and more like a weather forecast. Watch my granddaughter. Once a year is enough. You'll know the day when it comes. And when I asked her, that first meeting, how she'd know, Maggie stopped there and looked at the construction paper angel over my cot for a second. Your grandmother said, the day will look like this. My son and his wife will be done with her. She'll be standing outside their door with nothing of theirs left in her hands. It will probably be winter. I sat with the cocoa going cold in my fist. Everything in me that was still a daughter scrambled to file an objection. They're not bad people, I heard myself say. It's been a hard couple of years. Dad's stroke, the bills. You don't understand the pressure my mom is under. Maggie nodded along with a face that had heard testimony before. Ruth used to defend them in that exact voice, she said. Word for word. It used to make her so tired she'd have to sit down. And then she said the sentence I have carried every day since. The sentence I'd cross the street to keep another woman from ever needing. She leaned forward, took both my hands again, and said it gently. The way you deliver a diagnosis. Honey. She knew they would do this to you. That's why I'm here. The kids finished their carol. Everybody clapped. I sat on cot 14 in a warming shelter and let 20 years quietly rearrange themselves. Christmas morning, the shelter served pancakes and sent us out into a world that had no idea anything had happened. Maggie took me to the only diner open in Millbrook, ordered us both the number 2, and lifted a bundle out of her tote bag like it was a sleeping animal. Envelopes. A brick of them, tied with garden twine. 74 envelopes, every one addressed in my grandmother's upright schoolteacher hand to Miss Thea Bennett, Linden Court, Millbrook, Ohio. The stamps climbed 3 years of postal rates, from when I was 11 to when I was 14. 2 a month nearly, for 3 years. And across the face of every single one, in ink, in handwriting I knew better than my own, the same verdict. Return to sender. My mother's handwriting. That slanted, even, Palmer method cursive that signed my permission slips and my birthday cards, 74 times, sending an old woman back her love like a package that wouldn't fit through the slot. I laid them out on the diner table in rows while my eggs went cold. In my family, the story of Grandma Ruth had exactly 3 sentences, recited whenever a child asked, and designed to end the asking. She got difficult after Grandpa died. She got confused. She pulled away from the family, and it broke your father's heart. Nobody pulls away 2 letters a month for 3 years. Nobody confused keeps 20 years of property taxes paid. But I didn't know that part yet. What I knew, in a vinyl booth on Christmas morning, was that the woman I'd been told forgot us had written to me 74 times while I was 3 miles away, being told she didn't want to see me. The last envelope in the stack was postmarked in March. Maggie said Ruth died that same week, on a Thursday. I asked the obvious question, the angry one. If Grandma left me something, why on earth would she make me lose everything first to get it? What kind of love puts a condition like that on itself? Maggie stirred her coffee for a while. Then she recited it, and I could hear that she'd recited it to herself for 20 years because it came out with the worn edges of a prayer. Not while she lives under their roof. The day she's standing outside their door, with nothing of theirs left in her hands, give it to her then. Before that day, they would take it, and she would let them. I opened my mouth to argue with a dead woman, and then I closed it, because I ran the experiment honestly, the way you're supposed to. Say I'm 25. Say a lawyer calls. Your grandmother left you a property and some money. What does 25-year-old Thea do? I knew the answer before I finished the question, and so do you. There's a family meeting at the kitchen table. There's my mother saying it would be selfish to keep a windfall while the roof needs work, and your father's cholesterol is what it is. There's the phrase, family money, produced like a legal term. And there's me, good girl, strong one, little nurse, nodding, signing, pouring it into the pond with everything else I ever earned, and feeling virtuous for about a month. My grandmother hadn't set a condition on her love. She'd written a prescription, and like all the good ones, it was ugly, and it was exact. Do not administer until the patient can keep it down. Maggie watched me work all that out and didn't say a word. Then she paid the check and made one phone call on Christmas morning to a man named Alan Pierce. Alan Pierce turned out to be a semi-retired attorney with a small office above the bank, a cardigan the color of weak tea, and the unhurried diction of a man who has outlived every person who ever rushed him. He met us the morning of December 26th. Miss Bennett, he said, shaking my hand once, formally. I have kept a drawer locked for 20 years, and I would like to retire. Sit down. What he took out of the drawer was thinner than I expected. A trust. The Ruth Bennett Trust. Dated 2005. Inside it, a lake cottage out on Harlan Lake, 40 minutes north, which my grandmother had bought in 1974 with money from her late sister, and titled so quietly that her own son never knew it existed. And an account. Ruth had sold her house on Sycamore herself, at 73, before anyone could help her do it. Put $85,000 of the proceeds into the trust and instructed the firm to pay the cottage's taxes and insurance out of it for as long as the money lasted. 20 years of taxes, insurance, and a neighbor paid to keep the pipes from freezing had eaten it down to $23,600. Not a fortune, Pierce said, watching me over his glasses. She was very clear that it was not supposed to be a fortune. She said fortunes get families involved. Then he slid a small envelope across the desk, my name on it in that upright hand. Inside was a single brass key, threaded on a loop of soft, red-checked kitchen string. My breath went somewhere strange. I knew that string. It was the string from her kitchen curtains, the ones with the cherries on them. I used to braid the tiebacks while she rolled pie dough. Pierce cleared his throat. She said you'd know the string. She said that would do instead of a speech. Maggie drove me up that afternoon in her Buick, 40 minutes north on roads that got quieter and wider until Harlan Lake opened up on the left, like a held breath, frozen shore to shore. The cottage sat back from the water behind 2 bare maples, small white clapboard gone gray at the corners, a green door. The brass key turned like the lock had been waiting. Inside, the cold had that clean, still quality of a room nobody has lied in. 20 years of dust lay thin as flour. The neighbor had kept the pipes and the roof, not the shelves. Her quilt was folded over the rocker. Her recipe box stood on the counter, the tin one with the rooster, and the window over the sink looked out at the lake, the way a person looks at something they chose. And on the kitchen table, square in the middle, one envelope. For my girl, when they're done with her. I sat down in my coat and read my grandmother's letter in the light of a December afternoon. She told me what happened, without one drop of self-pity, in that hand that never wavered. How after Grandpa died, my parents began to manage her. The car keys first, then the checkbook, then the doctor visits she stopped being told about. How the word they used was help, and how the arithmetic underneath it was her house. How she sold it out from under the arithmetic, at 73, and how the bill for that came due in the only currency that could really hurt her, me. They stopped bringing me. They told her she confused the children. They told me she forgot us. She wrote to the very end anyway. And near the bottom of the last page, in letters slightly larger, pressed slightly harder, she left me the sentence I intend to be buried knowing. You were never the debt, Thea. You were the girl. I stayed. Of course I stayed. It was mine, though it took my body a week to believe it, and I kept catching myself tiptoeing like a guest. That dead week between Christmas and New Year's, I read all 74 letters in order, in the rocker, under her quilt, with the lake ticking and booming outside the way ice does. Reading them was like getting my own childhood back with the redactions lifted. Every summer after I turned 11, we were suddenly too busy for the lake. Now I knew why the invitations had never reached me. The postscripts asked about my spelling tests. She knew my teachers' names. She knew things my mother must have mentioned on the phone in the years before the door shut, and she hoarded them the way you hoard details of a person you're not allowed to see. And one letter, from the middle of the stack, stopped me cold, because it wasn't about her at all. It said, "They have started calling you our little nurse, and everyone laughs. And I do not laugh, Thea. You were 11. You'd been assigned the family pill, counting the way other kids get assigned the dishwasher." She saw the job description being written for my whole life while it was still cute. I sat with that one a long time. In January, I got practical, because practical is my mother tongue. Bought Maggie's grandson's old Civic for $1,200, transferred to the agency's Lake County branch, learned which floorboard groaned. I told nobody in my family where I was. Not out of strategy. I just wanted one place on earth with no arithmetic in it. In a town the size of Millbrook, I got exactly 9 days. It was the deadbolts that did it, which even I can admit is funny. I bought 2 at the hardware store out by the lake, and the woman ringing me up sings alto next to my mother's church friend Sharon, and by the following Tuesday, the Millbrook phone tree had processed, cross-referenced, and delivered its finding. Thea Bennett is living at Old Ruth's place on Harlan Lake. Did you even know Ruth had a place? On January 3rd, my phone lit up with a mom, and I stood at the kitchen window watching it ring 3 times before I answered. The voice that came out was one I hadn't heard in years. Warm. Melted butter warm. "Sweetheart," she said. "Christmas got completely out of hand. Everyone was under so much pressure. You know how your father's health has us all stretched thin. Come home, honey. We're family." I looked out at the lake while she talked. There is a translation exercise I do now. Automatic is taking a pulse. I listened to my mother and mark where the ledger pokes through the upholstery. It took 90 seconds. Because after "come home and we miss you and it's all a misunderstanding," her voice did a small businesslike shift, the one it does when the pleasantries have been paid. And she said, "And when you're home, we can sit down and talk about the lake place. As a family." There it was. I asked her one question. Quiet. No edge on it. A thermometer of a question. "Mom, whose name was on the deed of the house you just sold?" The line went so silent I could hear her kitchen clock. Then she said we'd talk soon, and love you, and was gone. She hadn't asked where I'd slept on Christmas Eve. It genuinely had not come up. My cousin Jess is 26, my Aunt Patty's daughter, and the only member of my family who texts me like a person instead of a subpoena. She called that week and gave me the picture nobody else would. The house on Linden Court hadn't sold because of the market. It sold because of the math. 2 years of Dad's rehab copays, a home equity loan I never knew existed, credit cards, back taxes. They'd closed at a bad price to close fast, and after the debts, there wasn't much left. They were renting a 2-bedroom condo out by the highway. Aunt Carol's been telling everyone you came into Grandma Ruth's money, Jess said, apologetic, like she was handing me something with a sharp side. Nobody even knew there was money. Mom's been on the phone about it for days. So that was the machine, and I finally saw it whole. I hadn't been kicked out in a fit of cruelty. I'd been liquidated, calmly, like the house, an asset that had stopped producing, cleared off the books before the move. It was somehow worse and easier, knowing that. You can't hate a spreadsheet. Late that same night, my phone rang again, and the screen said Dad, and my heart did something complicated because my father had not independently dialed a telephone since his stroke. I picked up and heard the long, effortful breathing first, then his voice, dragging its left side, each word hauled up alone. "Your grandma," he said. Long pause. "Made good pie." That was all. Somewhere behind him a television murmured. Then he hung up, or the phone slipped. I'll never know which. I stood in her kitchen holding the rooster recipe box like it was his hand. 2 days later, an envelope came from my mother. Thick paper. A dinner invitation. The card said, "New Year family dinner. Aunt Patty's house. Saturday at 6. Please come. We all want to start fresh." My mother's handwriting, that even slant I now knew from 74 envelopes. Maggie came for coffee and read it on the table without touching it, the way you look at a mousetrap. "You know it's a meeting," she said. "They'll have an agenda and you're the only item on it." I did know. I'd like to tell you I went in order to face them, armored and finished. But this is a true accounting. So here's the truth. I went because some ancient kid part of me heard we all want you there, and sat up like a dog at a can opener. Because it might be real. Because wanting your family to want you is not a character flaw, whatever it costs. And I had wanted it for 34 years and didn't know how to stop on 2 weeks' notice. But I'd changed in one measurable way, and I could feel it as I got ready. I wasn't bringing anything they could deposit. No checkbook, no paperwork, no decisions. I made a pie instead. Her crust, from the rooster box, the cherry one with the lattice I practiced twice first. And if you think a pie is nothing, you never learned what my grandmother could say with one. I drove the 40 minutes south with it warm on the passenger seat and my heart doing shift change handoff the whole way. Aunt Patty's porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see them all already seated in the living room, coats off, waiting. Nobody was laughing. It looked exactly like a deposition. They were lovely for 20 minutes. I want to give them that, because it makes what happened at minute 21 easier to believe, not harder. Patty hugged me at the door and smelled like the same perfume as every Christmas of my childhood. My mother said the pie was beautiful. My father sat at the end of the couch with his walker parked beside him, and when I kissed his cheek, his good hand found my wrist and pressed it, twice, like a code. Then the plates were cleared, and my mother set her coffee down with a click that called the room to order, and the agenda began. She'd printed pages. Actual pages from the realtor friend at church, a market analysis for a lakefront property, Harlan Lake, with a suggested listing price highlighted in yellow. They had appraised my grandmother's house before asking me to pass the rolls. "Your father needs care, Thea," she said in her reasonable voice, the one that arrives pre-insulted for when you disagree with it. "Real care, more than I can do with my back. That place is just sitting there. Ruth was family. She would have wanted it to take care of family. We sell it. We set up your father properly, and everything goes back to normal." Around the room, heads were nodding at me. Patty's husband, a cousin I hadn't seen since a funeral. I looked at my mother and asked what normal meant exactly, and she smiled like I'd finally asked a smart question. "You come home, sweetheart. We get a place with room for you. You help with Daddy. You're the nurse. In this family, love is earned, Thea. Your father earned yours the day you were born. There it was. The whole religion, in 2 sentences, with a yellow highlight. I set my fork down. I remember the sound it made, that tiny bell of it, because the room was that quiet, waiting for the strong one to say of course. And I heard myself speak in the voice I use at 3 in the morning when a family wants a feeding tube that will only prolong the dying, level, kind, and completely without give. I said no. I said I would not be selling my grandmother's house, tonight or ever. And then, because I had spent 2 weeks getting ready for this table even if I hadn't admitted it, I laid out what I would do instead. I'd already pulled together every discharge summary and medication list I'd kept for Dad across 2 years of refills. I named the Medicaid waiver program and the 3 facilities within the county worth touring, and the one with the stroke unit, Fernwood, where I knew the charge nurses by name. I said I would be his care coordinator myself, free, forever. Every appointment, every medication review, every family meeting, my number first on every chart. I'll give Dad my hands and my head, I said. The house stays Grandma's. You'd have thought I'd flipped the table. Patty actually stood up. After everything your mother has sacrificed. And my mother went white and then wet-eyed in a single practiced motion, and the cousin studied his coffee like scripture. Only my father didn't move. I gathered my coat, thanked Patty for dinner, and left the pie. Let me say this to you directly, before the door even shuts behind me. If you have ever told your family no, out loud, one time, one sentence, then you know the sound a room like that makes. Comment, "The room went quiet," if you've heard it, and subscribe, because what my mother did with that no is the reason this story has a third act. The story was loose in the family by Monday, and it was a good story, if you didn't know me. Thea got secret money from crazy old Ruth and turned her back on her dying father. Thea chose a dead woman's lake house over the man who raised her. 2 of my aunts quietly dropped out of my life. No announcement, just texts that stopped mid-conversation like a road washed out. The church casserole network processed me from person to cautionary tale in under a week. And I'd love to tell you it bounced off, but I'm the one telling this story. So, it landed. Every hit. Then Jess called, late, doing her packet of guilt about her mother, and in the middle of apologizing she gave me the missing page of my whole life. "You know Aunt Carol did it too, right?" she said. "The paycheck thing." I asked what paycheck thing, and Jess told me what Patty had told her once, wine loose at Thanksgiving, that my mother, at 19, worked the line at the Deering plant and handed the envelope to her father every Friday, sealed. That she'd been accepted to a nursing program in Akron, nursing of all the things on this round earth, and her father said a family is not a boarding house you leave when it suits you, and she stayed. She met my dad at that plant. She never mentioned Akron again. I sat with the phone warm against my ear and felt something I had no room for, pity, with rage still wet under it. My mother wasn't born holding a ledger. Somebody handed it to her at 19, at a kitchen table just like ours, and nobody ever told her she was allowed to set it down. Understanding it changed nothing about my locks. It changed everything about my aim. Here is the part of this kind of story nobody tells you, the part between the dramatic dinners. Ordinary life, ticking along, while your nervous system renegotiates its entire contract. I fixed the porch step. I took shifts at the lake branch, good ones, and came home to a house that asked me for nothing. Maggie showed up Sundays with crullers and did the crossword out loud in the rocker like she'd been issued with the property. By day, I was, honestly, happy. It was 3 in the morning that had teeth. I'd wake with my heart going and my brain already 6 lines into the old arithmetic. If I sold, if I signed, if I just went back and took the couch and the night shifts, Mom's voice would go warm again by Easter. I want you to hear how that felt from the inside, because from the outside it looks like weakness and it is not. It felt like a craving. Being needed had been my job, my rank, my face in that family for 34 years, and quitting it felt less like liberation and more like withdrawal. I'd lie in my grandmother's house at 3 a.m. missing my captivity like a lost tooth, tonguing the hole. On the worst of those nights, I did the only thing that helped. I wrote to my father. Just to him. A short letter, large print for his good eye. The 3 facilities, what each one cost, what Medicaid covered, my new number, and at the bottom, Dad, I'm not gone. I'm just done being the budget. Love, Thea. I mailed it to the condo on a Tuesday. 2 weeks later, an envelope came back to my box at the lake. It was my own envelope, my own handwriting on the front, Dad's name, the condo address, and across it, in that even, slanted Palmer method cursive, the same old verdict. Return to sender. I stood at the mailbox on a gray February afternoon, with the lake groaning behind me, and understood that I was holding letter number 75. Same hand, same words, same job the hand was doing. Standing between a Bennett and somebody who loved her for free. My mother had done to my letter, to my father, in the year of our Lord this year, precisely what she'd done to 74 of my grandmothers. Maggie's voice came back to me on the wind like a diagnosis confirmed by a second lab. She knew they would do this to you. There were no tears left in the account for my mother. That well had been drawn down for years. I drove home, and noticed the word, because I did. Home now meant the lake, and I untied the garden twine, and I set my envelope on top of the stack, and the stack accepted it perfectly. And something about that click of completion was the coldest thing I'd felt all winter. I made tea. I sat in the rocker with the quilt while the wind worked the shutters, and I thought, so that's finished then. That's the whole shape of it now. Nothing left that can surprise me. It was a Friday night, the first week of February. At 11 o'clock the phone rang, and it was Jess, and she was crying before she got my name all the way out. It's Uncle Ray, she said. Another stroke. A big one. They took him to County General. Thea. Aunt Carol's telling the doctors his daughter's a nurse and she's coming to take him home. I drove the 40 minutes south with the roads black and glittering, and I used every mile of it to decide who was walking into that hospital. Because 2 women could make that drive. One was the little nurse, the strong one, arriving to be spent. The other was somebody I'd been building for 6 weeks in a house by a lake. I parked, and I walked into County General as both his daughter and a professional, and God help anyone who tried to collapse the two. The neurofloor at midnight is a sound I know like my own pulse. Monitors, soft shoes, ice machines. My father looked small in the bed, smaller than the stroke 2 years ago had made him. One side of his face asleep for good this time. The speech was mostly gone, they said. Comprehension likely better than expression. His left hand, the good one, could still grip. I stood at the foot of the bed and read his chart the way other people pray, and then I asked the resident 3 questions. Swallow study, anticoagulation window, what they were thinking for disposition, and I watched the young man recalibrate who he was talking to. Through the glass of the family lounge I could see my mother watching me, not with relief. I have stood next to a lot of wives at a lot of bedsides, and I know what fear for a husband looks like at 2 a.m., and I want to be fair. Some of that was in her face too. But over it, moving like a hand over a column of figures, was the look I'd finally learned to translate. She was counting. The nurse had come. The asset was back in range. Before I left, the social worker touched my elbow. Discharge planning meeting. Monday morning. Family requested you attend. I said I'd be there. My mother had requested me. Of course she had. The meeting room on the 3rd floor had a Formica table, 8 chairs, a box of tissues, and an air purifier that hummed one flat note the whole time, like the building holding its breath. Present. The social worker, a discharge planner with a laptop, Aunt Patty, my mother, and me. The clinical picture came first, laid out gently. Dad would not be walking out of this one. He needed skilled nursing, 24-hour care, therapy services, a stroke recovery program, or a home setup that amounted to the same thing: hospital bed, Hoyer lift, and a trained caregiver essentially around the clock. The room absorbed it. Then my mother folded her hands on the formica, and I watched her arrange her face into its reasonable setting, and she presented what she called the family's plan. "My daughter is a nurse," she told the social worker warmly, gesturing at me like unveiling a solution. "An excellent one. 10 years of experience with exactly this, and she has a whole house standing empty out on Harlan Lake. Ruth's house. His own mother's house. Room for the equipment. Water views. Peace and quiet. He'll be with family, which everyone knows is better than any facility." The discharge planner started typing. The social worker looked at me, and my mother turned to me too, in front of all of them, and said the line she'd been saying in one dialect or another since I was 11 years old and counting pills into a saucer while the grown-ups called it adorable. She said it kindly. "That's the detail I want you to keep." She said it with love. The only love she had. The kind with a balance owing. "You're the nurse, Thea. This is what you're for." The air purifier hummed. Patty nodded. 20 years stood quietly behind my chair. A shelter cot, a brass key, 75 envelopes, waiting to hear what I'd say. I turned to the social worker first, because the system in the room deserved a clean answer before the family got its speech. I said, "I do not consent to being the discharge plan." I said it in clinical language, because clinical language is load-bearing. A single LPN working shifts cannot safely provide round-the-clock stroke care alone in a private home. That arrangement fails the patient first and the caregiver second. I've been called to houses where a family tried it, and I've seen how it goes. Twice over. The patient gets hurt, and the caregiver is a diagnosis waiting on a bed. The discharge planner stopped typing. Then I turned to my mother, and I gave her the rest, in the flattest, gentlest voice I own. I said I'd toured 3 facilities in January. She blinked. January was before any of this, because I'd read Dad's first stroke records and did the arithmetic she taught me. I said Fernwood has a stroke unit and a bed opening, that his Medicaid application was drafted weeks ago and sitting in a folder in my car, that I would be his care advocate on every chart. First call, every care conference, every medication review, every Tuesday, forever, free. "You get my hands and my head for the rest of his life," I said. "What you don't get is the house, the account, or me. Not anymore." Her voice started climbing. "After everything, and selfish, and your own father. And the older I get, the more I understand that shouting is just a ledger being read aloud. I waited it out the way you wait out weather." Then I said the last part, the part I'd been 34 years drafting. "You taught me love is earned in this family, Mom. You taught me my whole life. I'm done earning. I'm going to love him for free, from my own front door. And you've never once seen what that looks like. Watch me." She stood up slowly. My mother does everything to a metronome, even her ruptures. She gathered her coat, and her purse, and her printed pages with the yellow highlight that no one had looked at, and she assembled herself at the head of the formica table into the woman who has run every room she ever entered, and she handed down the sentence the whole religion had been building toward since before I was born. "Then you have no family." One short sentence, measured, final, almost calm. And Patty was already rising to follow her, already glaring at me on her sister's behalf, and the two of them went out the door in single file like a small, dignified funeral. The air purifier hummed, the tissues sat in their box, unbothered. And into that ringing quiet, the social worker, a woman my age with tired, decent eyes, slid one form across the table and said, in the softest bureaucratic mercy I've ever received, "The county will need a single point of contact for his care decisions going forward. Whom should I list? Whom should I list?" I looked at the empty doorway my family had just walked through. Then I printed my name in the little box, Thea June Bennett, and my number. And under relationship I wrote daughter, and my hand was steady the whole way, which the 3 a.m. version of me would want you to know. Both things were true at that table, and I signed for both of them. I had just become the person my father's life depends on, and I had just stopped being my mother's daughter in any currency she accepts. Out in the parking lot, the cold hit like a swung door, and my hand found the brass key in my coat pocket, the kitchen string soft under my thumb, and I stood by my car and breathed for 1 full minute by the clock. But I didn't leave the building. There was one visit left, and I went back up and sat by my father's bed in the 2 a.m. quiet, monitors keeping their soft green time. He was awake. His right side slept its permanent sleep, but the eye on the good side found me and held on. And I did the thing our family never once did in my hearing. I told him the truth. Slowly, at eye level, like he was a grown man who deserved his own life explained to him. I told him where he was going and why. I told him Fernwood, stroke unit, that I'd picked it myself in January, that I knew the charge nurses, that the therapy dog is a fat yellow lab named Biscuit. I told him I'd be there Tuesdays, every week, that his care meetings would have his daughter in them, that nobody would ever again decide things about him in a hallway he wasn't in. I did not mention Mom, and he didn't look for her behind me. Then his left hand came across the blanket and took mine and gripped, hard, the way he used to test whether a jack would hold before he'd slide under a car. His mouth worked at it. Speech was mostly gone, they'd said. But they don't chart what a man saves up for. It came out slurred, half a whisper, dragged uphill the whole way, and I will hear it in every quiet room for the rest of my life. Ruthie's girl. He knew. He'd maybe always known, behind that window, in that recliner, in that silence that I'm still learning to forgive. His grip held. I stayed until he slept. Dad moved into Fernwood the 3rd week of February. The Medicaid paperwork went through the way paperwork does when a hospice nurse has been filling out the family's forms for a decade. Correctly, the first time. He has a window bed. It faces a courtyard with a bird feeder, and the fat yellow lab makes his rounds on Thursdays. And my father, who has maybe a dozen laboring words left, has taught the whole unit the one that means dog. I'm there every Tuesday. I bring coffee for the charge nurse and the newspaper for him, and some weeks I bring the letters. I read them to him one at a time, his mother's voice in my mouth, and he listens with his eyes on the ceiling and his good hand gripping mine at the same places every time. The tomatoes, the spelling tests, the line about the little nurse. He was in that house while she wrote them. He let it happen. The letters say so. His grip says he knows. I read them anyway. That's what free costs, and I pay it gladly, every Tuesday. My mother visits him Sundays. The staff, bless them, figured out the choreography inside a month, and nobody has ever had to say it out loud. 2 shifts, no overlap. She tells her side of the family, her version. A daughter who chose a dead woman's house over her own blood. And I've stopped submitting corrections. Her ledger is the only language she was ever taught. And at 61, with a rented condo and a husband who saves his words for the dog, she keeps its accounts the way some women keep rosaries. I understand her now, which is not the same as letting her back in. The number she has for me rings a phone I check on Tuesdays, after Fernwood. Jess drives up to the lake most Saturdays. She's learning Grandma's crust, and she's terrible at it in a way that would have made Ruth take the rolling pin away with great love, and we eat the failures on the porch and I tell her the true stories. All of them, ages 11 and up. The pattern runs on believers, and my family just ran out of its next one. Maggie still comes Sundays. Retired investigators, it turns out, never fully close a file. She brought a folding chair for the porch in April and left it, which in Maggie is a marriage proposal. When the ice went out of Harlan Lake at the end of March, it sounded like the whole winter clearing its throat, and I stood on my porch with coffee and listened to it go. The porch step doesn't groan anymore. I fixed it myself, with her tools, from the shed. The brass key lives on a nail by the door now. It did its work. It's just a house key at last, resting on its loop of red-checked string. And some evenings I take the last letter out and read the line the way other people say grace. You were never the debt, Thea. You were the girl. It took 20 years, 9 trash bags, and a cot in a church basement. but I finally believe her. Here is what my grandmother knew, and what I know now, and what I hope you take home tonight. Any love that hands you a bill is not love, it's rent. And the people who really love you leave the door unlocked and the key on a string, and never once send you the invoice. Trash bags on a porch, a cot on Christmas Eve, a brass key on kitchen string. That's my story. If you're the one who carries your family, hear me. A boundary is not a betrayal, and you're allowed to love them from your own front door. If this story kept you company tonight, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories and tell me in the comments, what would you have done standing on that porch with your whole life in trash bags? I read everyone. And if you're the one keeping somebody else warm tonight, stay close. There's always room by this fire for you.